Good day, everyone. So, we are the group two, and for today, we are going to talk about the American period in the Philippines. So, before we proceed with this topic, let me introduce first the reporters. So, here are the reporters: Katapan Maria Victoria, Cabillo Kevin Clyde, Kamiging Hani, Kagadas Rialim, Castanilla Stephanie, Boyser Mikael, Camarillo Jundian, Quezon J. Mark, and Bernades Alaluna. So, for this topic, we are going to talk about the American colonization of the Philippines, the consequences of the American colonial rule, and also the changes that happened in the Philippines during the American period. So, let's talk first on how the Philippines was being colonized by the Americans. So we are already familiar with the Spanish-American War that happened. So it started in Cuba, and then this war it played an important role in the history of the Philippines since it brought drastic changes in the country and to its history itself. Okay, so let's talk first about how Spanish-American War started. Okay, so this war it started when President William McKinley so he dispatched the USS Maine to Havana. And then this USS Maine, it exploded and then it sank upon its journey going to Havana. Okay, so the incidents, they reported nga ang reason why the USS Maine was destroyed is because of a Spanish mine. So that is why the Americans they declared war against the Spaniards. So that is the start of the Spanish-American War. So let us get to know what is the participation of the Filipinos during this Spanish-American War. Okay. So Admiral George Dewey, so he went in the Philippines on May 1, 1898 in hopes of defeating the Spanish Navy that is in Manila Bay. So ang ilang gibuhat or ang iyang gibuhat is that he collaborated with the Filipino rebels in which it is participated and is headed by Emilio Aguinaldo. So that is the contribution or that is the participation of the Filipinos during this Spanish-American War. So they helped Admiral George Dewey to defeat the Spanish Navy that is in Manila Bay. On June 12, 1898, Filipinos led by Emilio Aguinaldo declared independence in Cavite El Viejo, which is known as Kawit Cavite in the present day. In that event also, the national flag was being unveiled in which it is made by Marcela Agoncillo, Lorenza Agoncillo, and Delfina Herbosa. The national anthem was also being played in which it is known as the Lupang Hinirang, composed by Julian Felipe, and is played by the San Francisco Malabon Marching Band. And also the Act of Declaration of Independence, it was prepared, written, and read by Ambrosio Rianzares Bautista. So after the proclamation, Apolinario Mabini became the advisor of General Aguinaldo. And then our government or the Philippine government in that time, it changed from dictatorial to revolutionary. So since Philippines has declared its independency, but this declaration it was opposed by the US. So diri kay suspicious kayo ang US no kay nganong lugar nga mag-oppose sila nga mag-declare ang Philippines og independency. So it just show that the US they wanted to colonize the Philippines. So for that it resulted into a guerrilla war against the American. So since sa Spanish-American War napildi man didto ang Spain, so kinahanglan nila magbayad og 20 million US dollars sa United States in accordance with the Treaty of Paris. So in the Treaty of Paris, this is an agreement and then in that agreement it stated in there nga ang Spain if ilang i-give up ang Philippines mahimo siyang colony sa United States. But in that agreement, the Filipinos were not being consulted, in which it resulted into a war against the Americans. Since ang Americans, they wanted to the Philippines to become their own colony. But dili man masugot ang mga Filipinos since na-under na ba ta sa Spaniards daan. So, ma-under na punta sa American. So, kapoy na kaayo, no? Because of that, it resulted into what we call the Philippine-American War. Okay, so this Philippine-American War, so na medyo tension daan. Kay daan pa lang sa pag-declare sa Filipinos og independency, di ba gi-oppose naman sa US. So na tension dito daan. Pero this Philippine-American War, it started yun when two American private patrol killed three Filipino soldiers in San Juan. So that is the start of the Philippine-American War. So there are 126,000 American soldiers that is involved in the conflict. And then, as we can see, there are only 16,000 Filipino soldiers that participated in the guerrilla movement. So makita nato nga there is really an advantage in the numbers. So imagine 16,000 lang ka Filipino. So dako jud kayo ilang ang disadvantage sa Filipinos when we say in numbers. Okay, so because of that, Aguinaldo dissolved the regular army in November 12, 1899. So the revolution of the Filipinos, so it ended when Aguinaldo was held captured by General Frederick Houston at Palanan, Isabela. And then Aguinaldo, he was brought to Manila on March 23, 1901. So kay kang Aguinaldo, useless naman ang iyahang pag-resist. So wala naman siya mabuhat gyud. So ayahan lang gido or yang gibuhat kay nagsumor siya allegiance sa United States. And then iha pong gi-call into attention ang mga Filipinos or his fellow compatriots in order to lay down their arms so that the war would bring to an end. But however, even though ngay nga nang nahitabo, there are still resistance in some various parts of the Philippines, especially in the Muslim South, until the 1913. So here are some pictures during that time nga nagwar. Let's talk about the changes that happened in the Philippines during the U.S. colony or the American period. So civil government was established by the Americans in the 1901, and then Howard Taft is the first American Governor General of the Philippines. And then during this time, English was declared as the official language of the country. And then also, since ang Spaniards man ang nag-spread sa Catholic Church or sa Catholicism. So, in the U.S. colony or the Americans, so they disestablished the Catholic Church, and then self-ruling were allowed in some areas also. And then an elected Filipino legislature was established in the 1907. Okay. So, those are what happened in the Philippines during the American period. And then those are also the changes that happened. Next that we are going to talk about today is the consequences of the American colonial rule. Okay. So, during the Spanish period, so ang mga Spaniards, dako kay sila og gihatag nga mga land properties so to the Catholic Church. So, that is why it is the first thing that Americans had taken care of. So, ilang redistribute balik ang mga land properties that is given to the Catholic Church. Okay. So, the small farmers or tenants that didn't get any land. Okay, so wala sila nakakuha og land because in order for you to have or to own the land, you have to pay certain amount manggod para ma-prove nimo nga ikaw ang landowner ana. So, that is why their land became property of some large landowners. The road towards Philippine independence. So before nahimong independent country ang Philippines, so there are many uh, processes that it had undergone. Daghan pa kay mga laws nga gipangpasa, and then one of it is the Jones Law. So the law was approved by President Woodrow Wilson after it was proposed by William Atkinson Jones, an American congressman. Okay, so in this law, it is stated in there that Filipinos have the right to attain freedom in the near future. So that is the Jones Law. And then it was passed in the US Congress in the 1916. And next law is what we call the Tidings-McDuffie Act. So this law was proposed by Millard Tidings and Congressman John McDuffie of the US. So it stated the 10-year preparation for the Philippine independence through a Commonwealth government. So in this law, so it had given the Philippines a new constitution in order to establish a much more stable government. This law also places executive power in the Governor General of the Philippines, that is appointed by the President of the United States, but established a bicameral Philippine legislature to replace the elected Philippine Assembly and appointed Philippine Commission previously in place. So in the 1934, the United States Congress, they had passed an act in what we call the Hair Hose Cutting Act as a Philippine Independence Act, but it is rejected by the Philippine legislature. So again, they passed a new Philippine Independence Act, and then it is popularly known as the Tidings-McDuffie Act. So in this law, so it provided the Philippines an independence in the 1946. So now let's talk about the Commonwealth government. So in the Hair Hose Cutting Act, so in which it is passed by the Congress in the 1932, so this law it provided the Philippines complete independence for about 10 years of self-government, but still under the supervision of the US. So in here, an election happened. It is on May 14, 1935, in order to fill the newly created office of President of the Commonwealth of the Philippines. And it was won by Manuel Alcazon. So this time, Filipino government was formed, but it is based on the principles and it is similar to the US Constitution. So, katong pagka-president ni Manuel Alcazon, so the Commonwealth was formally established. So, it was in the year 1935. So, the Commonwealth government, so they display a very strong executive, a unicameral National Assembly, and also a Supreme Court in which it is composed entirely of Filipinos for the first time since 1901. So even though the Commonwealth government they display a very strong executive, but still nagyapon sila gi-face ng mga uncertainties, especially the military situation in Southeast Asia, and also their uncertainty about how far the United States will commit to the future of the Republic of the Philippines. So now let us talk about the changes that happened in the Philippines during the American period. So there are a lot of changes that happened, but first let's talk about the changes in the government. So democracy, it is the greatest legacy the Americans gave us, in which it is divided in three equal branches. First is the executive under the president. Next is the legislative under Senate and the Congress. And lastly, we have the judiciary branch in where it is under the Department of Justice. So in executive, it is where the laws that is made were passed, and then final decision will be made by the president whether it will be approved or not. And then for the legislative, so the Senate and the Congress, they are the one who will create laws that would benefit the country. And lastly, the judiciary branch, so it is where the laws that is being approved will be acted upon or will be applied in respect to justice. And next is there are also changes in the education. So public schools were opened up, and then ang mga first teachers, so they are called Thomasites because they came on board from the USS Thomas. And the medium instruction that is used is English. And University of the Philippines, Philippine Normal College, and other agricultural schools were also established. Next, we have the religion. So, ang Catholic Church, since the Americans, they disestablish that religion. So, Protestantism was introduced. More or less, there are 300,000 Filipinos who became Protestant. Also, there is or there was a separation of the church and then the state. Then, ang mga Filipinos, so now they have the freedom to practice another religion. Next, we have also changes in the infrastructure and where the transportation and communication was improved and roads and streets and bridges. So it was built by the Americans and also infrastructure that would help the transportation of the products and services are also being made in order to just easily transport things or products. And then boulevards, zone districts, and centers of leisure were also established. The PNU, Manila Hotel, and PHG. So there's are some examples of the American architecture that is still present up until today's time. So not only that there are changes in the infrastructure, in the government, in religion, but also it had the American period had brought changes in the health and sanitation of the Filipinos. So they learned the value of cleanliness and healthy practices. So gitudloan sila og proper hygiene so that they will be healthy and free from contagious diseases. Also hospitals, clinics and health centers were established including public hospitals for lepers. So since during this time, ang leprosy, it is a very widespread disease. So that is why public hospitals, especially for people who had leprosy, were being made. And next, we also have changes in clothing. So the modes of dressing, so Filipinos was changed, and then for the men, they wore suits, polo shirts, ties, and jeans. And then for the women, they have dresses, high-heeled shoes, and handbags. And also food, just like the ice cream, the cakes, beef steak, hot dog, hamburgers, sandwiches, cookies, and donuts were introduced. And then, makita gihapon nato ang popularity ani nila up until today. Also, there are changes in the livelihood. Ang Philippine economy, so nag-boost during that time. There was an increase in the agricultural production, and then new industries were also developed. And dili lang kay there are changes in the physical things in the Philippines, but also it had an effect or there is a change in the attitude and that Filipinos became more frank and more humorous and then naka-develop sad og mga stronger beliefs in the rights and for the freedom. And also the traditional way of giving respect or showing respect is pagmamaanuman. But it was replaced by kissing the cheeks of the parents and elders just like the American way as a sign of respect. And for the language, so English language was widely taught all over the country that some of the English words became part of our vocabulary. Also, the Filipinos, so they adopted American names just like the Charlie, Anna, Francis, and Cherry. Okay, so those are the changes that happen in the Philippines during the American period. So even though that there are positive changes, but still the American colonization it brought a negative impact also. So first, let's talk about the Americanization of Filipinos. So the Filipinos, so they wanted to become more like American. So in lengths of crossing borders, so 'di ba Filipinos they go to another country in order to feel more like American. So next we have the colonial mentality. So this colonial mentality, it is an internalized attitude of cultural inferiority felt by the Filipino people as a result of colonization. So, the Filipinos, so they felt nga ang ilang culture kay inferior sa mga culture sa mga nag-colonize sa ilaha. So, this is very evident in our beauty standard. So, ang beauty standard din sa mga Filipinos is that if your skin color is white, so gwapa na jud ka. But we cannot force what we are not. Kay ang natural color ba gud sa Filipinos is moreno or morena skin. So, or color brown. So, yes, so this colonial mentality, so we are very affected with this one. And next is respectful Filipino ways of greeting were replaced merely by saying hi or hello. And also, Filipinos started to prefer white collar jobs. So when we say white collar jobs, so these jobs are what we call the administrative, managerial, or the office-like jobs. So mas prefer na ni sa mga Filipinos during that time the white collar jobs. And next, the traditional Filipino food, just like the bibingka, suman, so they were replaced by American food, just like the hot dog and the French fries, and lost our sense of bayanihan also. But atong sense of bayanihan is makita man nato in this time, especially during this time of pandemic, in where brilliant mind of Filipinos they created what we call community pantry, right? So I think naagyapon tay sense of bayanihan. So in summary, we seem to reject our own identity. So even though that it looks like that, nga, seem that we reject our own identity, but still, makita man gihapon nato in atong our Filipino identity in our food, in our attitude. So there are still traits nga nagpabilin nga we can say nga we are Filipino. Okay. So that would be all for our report about the American period in the Philippines. And then we hope that you have learned something. So have a great day and thank you very much.